As if we look back through history, there's two key processes that governments have used. Certainly in modern democracies, they've been using it for 150 or 200 years, but maybe it goes back even further. The first one is what I just call information sharing. And that's kind of a one-way directional flow. Basically, government wants to tell the public something for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's just good to educate them. Maybe it wants them to be informed on what it's doing. But it's really a matter of sending information out. It's not usually looking for responses. It's not necessarily listening. It's providing information. The second one, which is more interactive, it's a two-way flow, is what we'd call consultation. In consultation here, we use that word for a lot of things, but I want to use it fairly narrowly to mean a very specific kind of process. And we're all familiar with it. It just means this, is if I'm government, I may want to get the public's input on something. Maybe I want them to help me shape a decision. Maybe I want to know where they lie on a decision. So I go out and I pose a question. And this can happen in lots of forms. I could rent a room and invite people into the room. I could publish this online and ask them to respond. But the basic idea is this. I raise a question and you, the members of the public, respond and you give me your views. And I listen to your views, I record your views, and then I withdraw and I review your views behind closed doors. And I think this is key to see, because what happens then is your part of the process is over. I stand back, review those things, weigh them, make trade-offs, arrive at conclusions, and then I come out and tell you what my decision is. And I have consulted you on the solution if I've weighed your views fairly. And in fact, I'm going to add more than just collaboration. The usual distinction is between the two of them. But with consultation, I said earlier that this is a two-way flow, but I also said this. I said, I ask a question as government, you give me the response, I retreat, and I weigh the public's responses. I don't consult them on what I do then. I consult you on your view, I make a decision, and I tell you. What I would call deliberation is a slightly different form. Is I can come out and ask a group of the public for their views on something. Do you think we should build a school? Do you think we should fight a war? Do you think we should raise taxes? And all of you guys out there in the public get to tell me what you think. But in the second stage, this is where deliberation comes in, rather than retreating behind closed doors like a judge and weighing the evidence of what you've said myself, I go into another phase of the process and I say to you, you're not going home now, and I'm not going behind closed doors. You're going to sit around this table, you the members of the public, and I'm going to facilitate this session, and I'm going to get you to do the work that I would have done behind closed doors. You're going to weigh the evidence, you're going to trade off on values, you're going to assess what is the best outcome, and together your job is to weigh these things and come together around a solution. So you deliberate, and then I, government, take that solution and deliver it. The third thing, which goes just a little further, so that's deliberation. There's a fourth thing, Remember we talked about information sharing, we talked about consultation, we talked about deliberation. The fourth form is very much like deliberation. So what happens is first you get to say your views, then we go around the table and you guys work on trade-offs and values and priority setting together. But instead of passing it back to me, government, to deliver that solution, in collaboration, we're looking at a problem that I may not be in a position as government to deliver the solution myself. For example, suppose this is a deliberative problem on public health, right? And so you, the public, come together and I facilitate the discussion. I say, you say we need an action plan on health for this community. And so you pick 5 things we need to do to make the community healthier. It's going to turn out that if some of that stuff is, for example, getting exercise, a variety of things, I can't do that as government, right? The solution to that problem requires the participation of the public itself. So in collaboration, we not only deliberate on the solution, when it comes to delivering that solution, the public has a role and has to take ownership of some of that task. So government doesn't have the full resources to deliver the task, so we work together on an action plan to deliver it. Should I go through those one more time? So you can always edit it out. So there's information sharing is a one-way flow. I give you information, you listen. Consultation is a two-way flow. I ask you a question, you respond, I weigh your responses, I decide. Deliberation is a stage where I ask you a question, you the public respond, then you deliberate, and I act. And collaboration is deliberation plus shared action. So I ask you a question, You guys deliberate on the solution, and then we all find our own part on the action plan and take some responsibility, some shared responsibility for delivery. Those are the 4 fundamental types of engagement. Yeah, this is the great question. First of all, let me say in advance before I give you the punchline and tell you what some of them are, is I do believe that these are by and large greatly exaggerated, and processes done well will avoid them. I'll come back to that. So in no particular order, here's 3 things that governments worry about hugely. The first one is bad decisions. Remember what I said about deliberation. In consultation, I, government, make the decision. You get to give me a view, but I don't have to worry about you making a bad decision because I retreat behind closed doors and make the decision. And hopefully I weigh what you've said or what the public has said, but it's my decision so I can be confident it's a good one, right? In deliberation, I'm asking you, the public, to arrive at a decision. Governments sort of go, oh, God, who knows where they're going to end up, and we're going to get saddled with a bad decision, and now we've raised expectations among the public that we're going to do what they say, and they tell us to do something stupid and we have to do it. So that's a huge concern for government. Second thing is what I would call loss of role. Politicians in particular, but also senior public servants, but politicians believe, rightly, they are elected to make decisions. So lots of times they'll look and say, why would I ask you to do my job? Wasn't this why you elected me? So there's concerns that in fact this is actually undermining their democratic role in the system. And finally, I'll just give you a third one, is what I call gridlock. This is the one you hear particularly from bureaucrats, but also politicians, is, hey, you know what, if we're going to have one of these deliberative processes on the environment, right, building a pipeline, and we bring 25 stakeholders in the room, these guys are going to end up in gridlock in 15 minutes. They will disagree on everything, and then we'll be stuck with a bunch of people who can't agree and no solution. So don't ask me to go there. That's not going to work. Let me just say very quickly, this is a longer discussion, but I'll just give you a little response to this. All of these are genuine dangers if you design the process badly. How you design a process and the kind of process you use is critical. But this is a longer discussion. In each one of those cases, if I could walk you through a process on a particular problem and show you how you design the process well, you build checks and balances into the process that ensure that these things don't happen. The evidence that you can do that is usually when we do them well, we get good results. When you do them badly, you don't. It's a great question. There's a long answer and a short answer. Happy for you, I'll give you the short one. There's really 2 basic ways that collaboration improves government performance. What I would call effectiveness and what I would call legitimacy. So let me take these one at a time. Effectiveness is when, the classic definition of effectiveness in government is this, it's being able to use your resources and your authorities to achieve your goals. Suppose that my goal is to reduce carbon emissions, CO2 emissions in the air by X% or number of whatever the measurement would be. Effectiveness is setting a policy that actually achieves that goal. To the extent that it achieves that goal, it's good. The reason why effectiveness is so important, why collaboration is so important for effectiveness, we have to go back to what I said about a collaborative process. It turns out a lot of the outcomes that governments want to achieve are outcomes that they themselves don't have the resources and authority to achieve on their own. For example, if we want to do, I gave you the example before of wellness in a community. Some things governments can do in wellness. They could regulate, for example, the amount of emissions in the air so that maybe we're not breathing bad things and we feel better. But what they can't do is a whole bunch of other things about how our eating habits are, how we take care of our health, a whole bunch of other things that are essentially our responsibility. But governments do promise us wellness. They have wellness policies. So if you're a government and you promise a wellness policy, and a whole bunch of this stuff actually requires participation of citizens, and you don't collaborate with them, you're on the hook as the minister for delivering something that goes way beyond your capacity. And then you're on the hook for explaining why it doesn't happen. So collaboration is a way of essentially engaging the public to ensure that your program is effective by having the resources marshaled behind the goal and achieving the goal. Without it, you won't be effective. So the first thing is this, a whole bunch of things, not everything, a whole bunch of things are bigger than government, a whole bunch of its objectives, and to achieve those it needs collaboration. There's also legitimacy. Governments, increasingly in a complex world, Governments have to make decisions that are very, very hard to know or to make. It's hard to know what the right decision is when all kinds of factors are coming into play around an environmental decision, a wellness decision, a poverty decision. What causes poverty in a community? You know what? 100 things, 1,000 things. So it's very hard for 5 bureaucrats who are policy experts to sit in a room and say, here's the problem, here's the solution. In a simpler world, we could do that. What happens now is that in order to get really good decisions, we need the participation of a lot of people with experience, first-hand experience of the community and the brain power and the lived experience and the range of experience to sit down together and tackle the problem collectively so they make a decision that is effective but also is seen to be legitimate. Because then we can stand back and say, I see how we got to this decision. I can see that there's the kind of experience and evidence behind it that we need to understand it as a good decision. So it makes it easier for governments to deliver on the promise and deliver the commitment they make, because we stand back and say, okay, that makes sense. I see where it came from. So let me just say very quickly again, effectiveness is solving the complexity problem out there by marshaling other resources, and that makes it more effective. Legitimacy helps us deal with complexity by saying we actually bring the brain power and the bodies to bear on the solution that give government legitimacy that it wouldn't get on its own. I talked earlier about the 4 fundamental forms of engagement. I said there was information sharing, consultation, deliberation, and collaboration. What happens now is, and I think I also said that by and large, governments are still mainly using information sharing and consultation with a little bit of deliberation and a little bit of collaboration. Think of this as a toolbox. If you have a toolbox and you have a job to do, or a series of jobs, if you're a carpenter and there's various things you do, you need the right set of tools in your toolbox, right? If all you got is a hammer, you're in big trouble. It's great when you're pounding nails. It's not so good when you got a saw and board. Processes are the same thing, is that the first thing we need is a toolbox, an engagement toolbox that has all the tools that we need in it. So the first thing we got to do is say we need all 4 of those tools in there. But it's not that simple. Now you have to know which tool fits which problem. Use the wrong tool, get the wrong solution. And governments are doing this all the time. For example, they use consultation in all kinds of places where they really need collaboration. They use deliberation where they should use something else. So what we really need is a systematic way, a principled way, I would call it a manual or a guidebook, that tells us not only what's in the toolbox, but when and how to use which tool. And I guess I would say this, I'm now working on this project with the Government of Ontario, where we are designing a toolbox and we are designing a manual to go along with it. And that will give the public service a principled basis for deciding when and where to use which processes. As it stands right now, it's incredibly ad hoc. A government decides we need an engagement process on this, and the minister or the deputy minister or somebody decides, let's use this tool. And lots of times you see them out there with a hammer trying to saw a tree. You want to say, that's wrong, right? So the short answer is what we need is some serious reflection on sorting out the options and developing a systematic, principled way for how and when to use them. That can be done. We're working on that in Ontario. Well, there's a number I could give you, but I'll stick with 2. And one of them, the first one, is absolutely cardinal. It's another thing that we get wrong all the time, is that when we do collaborative projects or try to do collaborative projects, the big mistake we make is we bite off more than we can chew. And what I mean by that is, I said earlier that when we do a collaborative project, it's because we usually have a problem that has a lot of different facets and requires a number of people working on the solution and delivering the solution. Remember, I gave you the example of a wellness program. But you can only get people to do so much at a time. And if you take a problem, for example, wellness in a community, or let's take a bigger problem, let's take the environment, right? If you want to try and solve the environment, climate change, in one round, you're biting off a really big problem. And what happens is governments have a tendency to think, okay, we need collaboration or we need some sort of other process. So they walk in and they don't stop to think, how much can we chew in one round? So they try to bite off a great big problem, the whole problem. And as I like to say, if you bite off more than you can chew, you're going to choke on it. What we really need to realize is this, is that in big problems, you have to treat them cyclically. So you may need a consultation or, sorry, a collaboration process that gets you started, but the first thing you got to do is stand back and look at the size of the problem and find a place you can carve out a piece of it so that the people around the table who are part of that project can get a hold of that problem and figure out what the solution is and find the solution, develop an action plan, and deliver it. By the time they go around that circle of having analyzed and delivered that action plan, they will have built up a relationship with each other, they'll have a better understanding of the solution, they'll have some confidence and trust from having worked together, and now they can actually take another bite out of the problem. So that it's not just a once-off, this becomes actually a cyclical way of doing business over potentially a long period of time. Something like climate change or poverty reduction or something may never be solved, but what we can do is by taking bites off it, increasingly bigger bites, we get very good at essentially cycle after cycle solving bigger and bigger parts of the problem. The problem may recur in other ways, but we begin to get a handle on it and make real progress. So rule number one is never bite off more than you can chew. I'd say the second thing, and this is pretty simple to understand, but it really bears saying, these are complex processes. They require a lot of deliberation and discussion. They don't have to go on forever, and they shouldn't, but you need adequate time and resources for the people around the table to have the conversation they need to have, recognize that they're in this together, try to figure out what their role is in solving it, build up the trust that if I do my part, you'll do your part, figure out how to use your resources and get them marshaled. And if you don't give them the time and the resources, or if you don't have that in the project begins to break down very quickly. So you've got to have adequate time and resources. Can I say one last thing about that? I underline that because there's a tendency in government, they're used to consultation processes. Oftentimes they don't work well, they just want to get through them. So they'll say to the public servants, I want this done in 3 weeks. You can't do a process like this in 3 weeks. And if you try, you'll wreck the process. So if you're going to do a serious piece of collaboration, you've got to take the time it needs to do it. It shouldn't be too much time, but it needs to be enough. I'll stick with one here, although I think even the way I'm going to say it, it might have larger application. One of the things people worry about is, okay, if I'm going to go and engage a community, do I have to talk to everybody? Who do I talk to? How many people? How do I figure this out? And there's a tendency to think you're going to have to talk to everybody in order to get the legitimacy that I talked about before. Let me double back and say this. Even though when we go into an engagement process that requires like direct engagement with people and we want them to have a voice in the process beyond consultation, genuine deliberative participation in the decision making, this is not what I would call direct democracy. Lots of people think this is direct democracy, and by direct democracy they mean we're going straight to citizens to give them a voice. I actually think this is better understood as a form of representative democracy, and I want to explain why. If it turns out that you've got to make some difficult decisions, let's say in a municipal context, around budgeting or something else, it may turn out that you can't go out to too many people. If you start getting too many people in the room, you can't have a deliberative process. It breaks down. You can't have 10,000 people. You can't even have 500 people in there. But you know what? If you actually look at the interests that are involved in making a lot of these decisions, usually by the time you count 10 or 15 or 20 different ranges of interests, those are the interests that keep repeating. People are clustered around those different interests. So what you really need to be able to do to give this kind of process, I think, effectiveness and legitimacy is to make sure that all of those interests are fairly represented around the table so that the people outside the circle know there's someone in that circle whose voice is being listened to and who sounds a lot like them and who is speaking for interests they are concerned about. It turns out, especially with citizens and even with groups, with stakeholders and advocacy groups, if they think the process is open and transparent and they believe that their voice is being spoken for, they aren't necessarily upset that it's not their voice as long as their interests are being treated fairly. And I think that recognizing that is a really important best practice because it means you can keep processes relatively small without losing legitimacy and people still feel like the outcome is acceptable. Actually, in some ways, the answer to that question is easy, and maybe even in hindsight will look obvious, as it should. You'll remember that I said the reason we want collaboration in the first place, and I'm now speaking from the point of view of government, is lots of the outcomes, the public policy goals that we have are bigger than government. Wellness, poverty reduction, and so on. We will only achieve poverty reduction by mobilizing a range of stakeholders along with government and even individual community actors and families and so on to tackle poverty as a complex problem, right? So if that's the case, what that tells us is lots of these problems that are genuinely public policy issues are not necessarily government problems. In the past, we've had a tendency to think if it's a public policy issue, it must belong to government, or a public good, if you want to say. I think all that organizations like ACDS need to do or should do is identify some issues where they have natural leadership because so much of the public policy space for that issue falls to them naturally. I'm sure there are lots of issues. I mean, a program that I worked with in Ontario, a process that I ran in Ontario with a bunch of organizations, community service providers that were delivering education services to disabled people, had exactly that same problem. And what they discovered is that one of the things that helps clients work through the system of employment training and get from the beginning all the way to the end is if there's a mentorship program, so there's somebody there that's gone through the program and helps them. But building a mentorship program across the community is something that community organizations are way better positioned to do than government. So there's nothing that stops them from getting together and saying to each other, we would all benefit from having a community-wide mentorship program that we all develop together and we maintain together and we derive the benefits from together. You may not need government at all. And there's a big gain to be made. No organization is big enough to do that on their own. They need to collaborate and they'll benefit from it. So my answer to your question, I guess, is what you really ought to do is look for collaborative issues that fall naturally way more in your bailiwick as an NGO than they do to government. And believe me, there are a dime a dozen. You won't have any trouble finding them.